He handed her divorce papers in the rain and called her nothing. She signed them, threw them at his feet, and drove away, and by the very next morning, every guard on that estate had turned away from him and dropped to their knees before her. This is Emily Scott Lee's story. And it begins the night her husband made the last mistake of his life. Seoul does not do anything quietly. Even at dawn, when most cities are still gathering themselves, Seoul is already moving, its towers punching through low morning cloud, its streets glittering under the remains of overnight rain, its energy carrying that particular low hum of a place that never fully sleeps and never fully rests. It is a city that demands you show up with something to prove or something to hide, and it has no patience for people who arrive with neither. Emily Scott arrived with both. She was 26 years old when she stepped off the plane at Incheon with 2 suitcases, a deliberately stripped name, and a need so deep and so private that she hadn't yet found the right words for it. She moved through the arrivals hall with her chin up and her jaw set, a tall, dark-skinned woman with full natural hair she'd pulled back at the base of her neck, wide eyes that missed nothing, and a composure so practiced it looked effortless to everyone who didn't know what it was costing her. Nobody at that airport knew her name. Nobody in Seoul knew what that name carried. For the first time in her entire life, Emily was not a legacy. She was just a woman with luggage and a one-way ticket, and the relief of that anonymity hit her so hard she had to stop in the middle of the arrivals corridor and breathe through it. She had chosen Seoul the way you choose somewhere that has no memory of you. She had no history here, no expectations trailing behind her like a shadow, no one who would look at her face and immediately begin calculating what she was worth or who she was descended from. She found an apartment in Mapo, small, practical, with a narrow balcony overlooking a side street where a pojangmaka vendor set up every evening, and the smell of tteokbokki drifted upward in the cold air. She took a modest office job that required nothing from her except consistency and quiet competence. She bought a second-hand scarf from a market stall near Hongdae and wore it knotted loosely around her throat on cold mornings. She drank coffee from a chipped blue mug on her balcony and watched the Han River on evenings when the light turned the water copper. She let herself be ordinary, and the ordinariness felt like medicine, slow and steady and healing something she didn't fully have a name for yet. Back home in America, Emily had been a specific and weighty thing. She had been the granddaughter. Her maternal grandfather, Chairman Lee, was the kind of man that people in certain rooms spoke about the way other people speak about weather systems. You didn't argue with him. You didn't underestimate him. You adjusted your plans according to which direction he was moving, and you hoped he wasn't moving toward you. He had spent decades building the Lee Group, not a corporation, not a firm, but a ruling architecture that sat above every significant syndicate operating across Seoul's underground and several other cities besides. He moved power the way skilled hands move water, not by force, but by knowing where the channels were and who controlled them. Men with far more obvious muscle and far louder reputations had learned, at real cost, that the Lee Group was not a thing you tested. Emily had grown up inside that gravity. She had sat at formal dinners at 12 years old listening to conversations she was not supposed to understand, and understanding every word. She had watched her grandfather receive men in his study, who left smaller than they entered. She had felt, from the time she was old enough to have opinions about it, the particular weight of being designated as someone's continuation, someone's legacy, someone's proof that everything they had built would outlast them. She loved her grandfather with a complexity that grief later made permanent. And she resented what he represented the way you resent a coat that is too heavy for the weather, not because the coat is wrong, but because you are not ready to carry it yet. When he died, he left everything to her. Not in pieces, not divided among distant relatives or business associates. Everything. Sealed in documentation so thorough and so legally airtight that no one had been able to do anything except comply with it. Emily had read the papers once, in a lawyer's office in New York, with the winter light coming flat through tall windows, and then she had flown to Seoul and become Emily Scott, not Emily Lee. Not the heir. Not the granddaughter, Emily Scott. The woman who was going to find out what life felt like when it belonged only to her. And for a while a genuinely beautiful, while she found it. She met Gu Jun Kang at a rooftop gathering she almost didn't attend. A colleague had insisted, and Emily had gone out of politeness and a vague hope that the view would be worth the effort. She remembered standing near the railing with a glass of champagne. She wasn't really drinking, watching the city arrange itself below her in patterns of light and shadow, when she became aware of someone standing close enough that she caught the scent of him before she saw him, something dark and clean, like wood smoke without the fire. She turned. He was looking at Seoul the way she was. Not performing enjoyment of it. Actually seeing it. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, narrow at the jaw, with a face that would have been almost too symmetrical if not for a small scar that cut through his left eyebrow and gave the whole thing character. He wore a dark suit with the kind of fit that doesn't happen by accident, and he held his champagne glass loosely, like something he'd forgotten he was holding. He had the posture of a man who has never once needed to make himself bigger in a room, because rooms have always responded to whatever size he naturally occupied. He noticed her noticing, and instead of performing confidence at her the way men sometimes do when they catch a woman looking, that sudden inflation of the chest, he simply turned a few degrees more toward her and said, with what sounded like genuine curiosity, "What are you looking at?" "The river," she said. "From up here, it looks still." "It isn't, but it looks it." He glanced toward the Han. "Most things that look still aren't." It was not a remarkable line. But the way he said it, like he meant something personal by it, like it was an observation he had arrived at through actual experience rather than performance, caught her somewhere beneath the rib cage, where her defenses were thinner. His name was Gu Jun Kang. He said he ran a high-end logistics firm, and he said it the way people say things they've practiced until the rough edges smooth away, not a lie exactly, more like a selected truth, the kind of answer that is technically accurate and completely misleading. Emily didn't press. She understood, from a lifetime of conversations in her grandfather's house, that powerful men rarely describe themselves correctly to people they've just met, and she had no particular leverage to demand the full version. What she had was this: the way he listened. Really listened, head slightly tilted, eyes steady on her face, asking follow-up questions that proved he had actually processed her previous answer rather than simply waiting for his next turn to speak. The way he laughed genuinely, not for effect, catching himself on it like it surprised him. The way he noticed, an hour into the conversation, that her champagne was warm and untouched, and quietly exchanged it for a glass of water from a passing tray without drawing attention to either the gesture or her discomfort with alcohol. She was alone in a city of 10 million people. She was grieving a grandfather whose death had come with the additional complication of an inheritance she didn't know what to do with. She was healing something still tender and still raw. And this man was warm in exactly the way that loneliness teaches you to recognize warmth with a precision that is almost clinical, because lonely people learn to see warmth the way people learn to find water in dry places. By necessity, by thirst, she fell. And she knew she was falling. And she fell anyway. They were married within a year. There is a particular quality to happiness that you don't fully appreciate while you are inside of it. You only recognize what it was later, when you are holding its absence and trying to understand the shape of what you've lost. For Emily, the first year of marriage to Kang had that quality. The apartment they shared in Gangnam was immaculately maintained and somehow still felt lived in, his coffee cup always beside hers on the kitchen counter, his suits hanging in the wardrobe in a precise row that made her smile because it was so completely him, his hand always finding hers under restaurant tables without any visible intention to do so. Just a quiet reach, a quiet claim, like breathing. He made her feel safe in a way she had not felt safe since her grandfather was alive. Not protected in the shielded, passive sense. Safe in the active sense, like she was standing on solid ground, like there was something real beneath her that would hold. She had not known how much she needed that until she had it. She did not ask too many questions. This is something Emily Scott would later understand about herself, that she had been trained by a complicated life to recognize certain textures of silence and to leave them alone. The men who came to meet Kang in places that weren't quite offices. The way conversations in rooms she entered sometimes shifted in register, dropping a careful note the moment she crossed the threshold. The deference other powerful men paid him at functions, a specific kind of deference, weighted differently than professional respect, carrying something older and less comfortable in it. She noticed all of it and filed it under a category labeled "not my business" in the way that people who grow up adjacent to power learn to do, because asking directly tends to produce answers that cannot be unfiled. She had grown up watching her grandfather. She knew what this world looked like from the outside. What she didn't know was how much of it was already hers. The coldness arrived the way all quiet endings arrive, without announcement, without a clear point of origin, just a gradual shift in temperature that you explain away day after day, until you have explained it away so many times that you stop being able to remember what warmth felt like. Kang's evenings grew longer. His phone lived face down on every surface: the coffee table, the nightstand, the edge of the bathroom counter, and when it vibrated against those surfaces in the night, he was out of bed and into the hallway before the second pulse. He stopped reaching for her hand at restaurant tables. He stopped catching himself on a laugh. The specific gravity that had once organized itself around her when they were in a room together began, very slowly, to tilt elsewhere. Emily noticed. She is not a woman who does not notice things. She has never been that woman. She noticed every degree of the shift and she absorbed each one, and she told herself, with a discipline that cost her something real, that she was projecting, that she was reading damage into something clean, that a woman who had grown up in the world she grew up in, who had lost what she had lost, was simply inclined toward expecting betrayal, and that expecting it didn't make it true. She was not projecting. Jia arrived in their lives as Kang's newly appointed personal secretary, and Emily understood in the first 30 seconds of their first meeting exactly what kind of appointment this was. She was striking in the precise, architectural way of a woman who has studied her own face and constructed around its sharp cheekbones, carrying a particular light, a mouth set in the permanent suggestion of amusement, eyes that moved across a room and catalogued everything in it with the efficiency of someone who is always calculating. She wore gowns to corporate functions, not dresses gowns. The kind of choice that says, "I intend to be the most memorable woman in this room, and I have dressed accordingly." She had a way of standing near Kang that read as professional until you tracked her hands always angled toward him, always hovering at the edge of contact that hadn't happened yet, a performance of restraint so precise it was louder than touching would have been. Emily watched this with a flat, clear vision of a woman who has spent a lifetime learning to see things without the softening filter of wishful thinking. She saw Jia. She saw Kang not moving away. She saw the shape of what was growing between them, and she named it in the privacy of her own chest, and then spent 3 months trying to unname it, because naming it meant acting on it, and acting on it meant dismantling the only life she had managed to build that felt like her own. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, a note requesting her presence at the Kim estate for a family dinner. Emily dressed carefully. A wine-red wrap dress that settled warm against her dark skin and caught the light at her collarbone. Small pearl drops at her ears. Her hair down full and natural and falling to her shoulders, the way she wore it when she was trying to remind herself she was beautiful on her own terms. She stood in front of the mirror for a moment longer than she needed to. Something felt wrong. Not dramatic, not loud, just a small, persistent wrongness sitting in her chest like a pebble she couldn't locate precisely enough to remove. She dismissed it. Got in the car. Drove through the rain. The iron gates of the Kim estate were already open when she arrived. The floodlights were blazing across the marble courtyard. Emily stepped out of the car, and the rain hit her immediately, cold and steady, soaking through her wrap dress at the shoulders, pressing her hair flat. She walked toward the entrance, and she stopped. There was no dinner table. No family. No warmth. Gu Jun Kang stood in the center of the courtyard in a dark fitted suit, and beside him, pressed against his arm with the settled ease of someone who has already decided she's won, stood Jia. She was wearing a shimmering silver gown that caught the floodlights and scattered them back like a deliberate provocation. Her chin was lifted. Her eyes found Emily across the courtyard and held them with an expression so openly satisfied that it made the air between them feel thick. Kang did not look Emily in the eyes when he spoke. He extended his hand. And it was a stack of legal documents, crisp and white even in the rain, pages and pages of careful, thorough finality. His voice when he spoke was empty of everything that had once lived in it, the warmth, the weight, the specific way he used to say her name like it meant something to him. What was left was flat and deliberate and final. "Sign them, Emily." A pause. "It's over." He told her she had been a temporary fixture, a naive American girl he had tolerated out of pity. He said Gia understood the weight of his world in a way Emily never had. He said she was nothing, and he said it without raising his voice, without cruelty in the conventional sense, which is always so much worse than cruelty with heat in it, because it means there is no feeling left to fight against. Gia tilted her head against his shoulder, and a slow, satisfied smile curved her mouth. She said, loudly enough for every guard standing at the estate's perimeter to hear, that the true master of this estate had no use for a charity case-playing wife. That Emily could pack her bags and go back to America where she came from. Emily stood in the rain and felt every word land. The cold was in her clothes now, pressing through the wet fabric against her skin. The rain was running into her eyes, and she was not blinking it away. She was standing in it, perfectly still, holding the documents in both hands and looking at the man she had loved and feeling something enormous and devastating shift inside her. Not breaking, shifting. Like the ground adjusting its weight before a different kind of stillness settles over it. She was not going to beg. She had never been a woman who begged, and she was not going to start here, in the rain, in front of his guards, for a man who had just told her she was nothing with the ease of someone discarding a receipt. She walked to her car. She spread the papers across the hood, and the rain hammered against them, and she signed every page line after line, her signature steady and clear and containing no hesitation. Then she gathered the full stack, and she turned and she threw them at his feet. The pages scattered across the wet marble in a wide, white arc. She did not look at his face. She got in the car. She pressed both hands flat on the steering wheel, and she drove into the dark and the rain, and the storm swallowed the estate behind her. Kang stood in the courtyard and watched her taillights disappear and believed, with the complete confidence of a man who has never been wrong about his own power, that he had just closed a chapter, that she was gone, that the path in front of him was clear. He did not know her full name. He had been sleeping beside Emily Scottley for 2 years. He had called her naive. He had called her a temporary fixture. He had stood in the courtyard of a house that had never belonged to him, that had, in fact, always belonged to her, and told her she was nothing. And now she was driving through his city, every street, every building, every underground contract toward a phone call she had been delaying for 4 years. BY morning. He would understand what he had done to BY morning. The whole estate would. She did not go to a hotel. Emily drove through the storm with both hands white-knuckled on the wheel, and the wipers cutting furiously across the windshield, and soul-pouring rain down on everything like it was trying to wash something away. She didn't cry. Not yet. The tears were somewhere behind her sternum, pressing hard against the bone, but they couldn't find an exit because she was still running on the thing that had replaced feeling, that cold, precision-sharp clarity that takes over when a person has been hurt so deeply that the nervous system decides emotion is a luxury for later. She drove to the apartment. Not the Gangnam estate, the other apartment. The small one in Mapo she had quietly kept in her own name from the first year of the marriage, not as a plan, not as strategy, just as instinct. A lifeline she hadn't known she was threading until tonight, when she needed it to be there. She let herself in. The air was stale and cold from disuse. The rooms were dark. She didn't turn on the lights. She sat on the floor, back against the wall, wet dress still clinging to her skin, and she held the silence the way you hold something fragile carefully with both hands. Outside, the rain against the windows was the only sound, and she let it be enough. This is the part no one tells you about devastation. It doesn't arrive as pure sadness. It arrives as a full audit. Every moment you chose to ignore, every instinct you filed away under wishful thinking, every morning you watched him reach for his phone before he reached for you and told yourself it meant nothing. It comes back all at once, And you sit in the dark with the evidence of your own careful, deliberate blindness, and there is nowhere to put it except inside your own chest. Emily was not a woman who had ever been naive about the world. That was the specific cruelty of what Kang had said, that she was naive, that she hadn't understood the weight of his world. She had been born into a heavier version of that world. Language for it. She picked up the phone. The number she dialed, she had not dialed in 4 years. It rang once. Just once. Miss Lee. The voice on the other end was low and measured, and utterly unsurprised. We've been waiting. Emily closed her eyes. Outside, thunder rolled across the city. It's time, she said, 3 words. The simplest sentence she had ever spoken. And the moment they left her mouth, something in the apartment shifted, the air, the atmosphere, the particular quality of the dark, as if the room itself understood that the woman sitting on its floor had just stopped running. Chairman Min did not ask questions. He did not require explanation or context or the rehearsal of grievances. He said, "I will have everything ready before dawn. The convoy will move at first light." Emily sat on the floor a little longer after she ended the call. Not because she was uncertain, she was not uncertain, but because she was saying goodbye to something. To Emily Scott, the quiet woman with the second-hand scarf and the chipped blue coffee mug, who had built 4 years of ordinary life in a city that had no memory of her. That woman had been real. The love had been real. The grief of losing it was real, even if what it was built on had not been. She let herself feel it. All of it, for exactly as long as it deserved. Then she stood up. She walked to the wardrobe at the back of the apartment, the one she had never opened since the day it was delivered, the one she'd told herself she might never need. She opened it. Inside, sealed in garment bags and waiting with the patience of things that have always known they would eventually be called for, hung the things that belonged to Emily Scott Lee. She reached for the gold. Across the city, at the Kim estate, the lights were still blazing. Kang and Jia were inside, champagne glasses raised, the warmth of the estate wrapping around them like a reward. Jia laughed, head thrown back, the silver gown catching the chandelier light, her whole body loose with relief and victory. She was already mentally redecorating, already imagining her name on documents, already wearing the title like a gown she'd had tailored. Kang accepted the praise of his men. He made calls. His path to full syndicate leadership, the ascension he had been engineering for 3 years, was now clear, the last obstacle removed, the last complication signed away and driven into the rain. In the kitchen, a guard entered and spoke quietly. A convoy had been spotted on the outer road. Unregistered plates. Vehicles they didn't recognize. Kang waved him off without looking up from his champagne. "Probably nothing," he said. He raised his glass again. Jia touched hers to it with a light, crystalline sound. The gates had 47 minutes left before they opened. The rain had stopped by the time the first light came. Seoul at dawn is a particular kind of beautiful, washed clean by the night storm, the streets gleaming, the air carrying that cold, sharp clarity that only exists in the hour before the city wakes and fills itself back up with noise and heat and the friction of 10 million lives moving against each other. The Kim estate sat in that stillness like a thing holding its breath. The marble courtyard, rinsed pale by the rain, caught the early light and scattered it in long flat angles across the stone. The floodlights were still on from the night before, redundant now against the growing morning, casting shallow shadows at the feet of the iron gates. Kang and Jia had emerged from the estate a little before 7. He was in a charcoal suit, sharp and composed, moving with the proprietary ease of a man who has just confirmed his own importance. Jia was beside him in a cream silk blouse and fitted trousers, her hair pinned back, her posture carrying the particular confidence of a woman who has spent the night deciding how she will spend the rest of her life. Their drivers had brought the vehicles around. The morning felt, to both of them, like the first page of something. Then the iron gates opened. They opened before the convoy had slowed. Before there was a request, a clearance, a code entered. They open the way things open when they recognize an authority too fundamental to be managed by protocol automatically, completely, with a weight and a certainty that made Kang's driver take an involuntary step backward. Point three armored vehicles rolled onto the marble driveway. On the door of the lead vehicle, embossed in gold against the black, a crown. Kang's personal guards went rigid the moment they saw it. The golden crown of the Lee group. Kang stared. His jaw moved without producing words. Beside him, Jia had gone very still, her hand finding his arm with a grip that had nothing of last night's confidence in it. The center vehicle's door opened, and Emily stepped out. She was wearing the gold dress, a stunning, low-cut sequined gown that moved with her like liquid metal catching fire, every facet responding to the morning sun until she seemed to be generating her own light. Her dark skin against that gold was extraordinarily rich and luminous, the kind of contrast that stops a room. Her hair fell in full, perfect waves to her shoulders, and at her throat and wrists the diamonds she wore were not decorative, they were deliberate, each one a statement that this woman had not come here to be overlooked. Her face was composed in a way that was more devastating than any expression of anger could have been, not cold, not cruel, simply settled, like a woman who has already decided how this ends and is simply here to confirm it. In her left hand, she carried the divorce papers Kang had forced on her the night before. And her right hand, loosely, almost carelessly, she turned the keys to the entire empire. Kang's jaw dropped. Every carefully maintained piece of his cool, tattooed composure simply fell away. Jia's hand tightened on his arm, and he didn't feel it, because every nerve in his body was occupied with the complete and catastrophic reorganization of his understanding of the last 2 years. From the lead vehicle, an older gentleman descended. Formal black suit, white silk gloves, movements precise and unhurried in the way of a man who has served at the highest levels of power for so long that urgency has become beneath him. Chairman Min, the legal custodian of the Lee Group's absolute authority, her grandfather's most trusted architect, the man who had spent 4 years waiting with the patience of someone who understood what was coming and simply held the documents in readiness. He opened the leather folio. What is the meaning of this? Kang's voice came out thinner than he intended. He reached for authority and found the container empty. This is my estate. Who authorized? Chairman Min's voice rang across the courtyard, clear and unhurried, and completely without mercy. By the absolute and irrevocable decree of the late Chairman Lee, full and exclusive ownership of the Kim estate, the logistics syndicates, the bank accounts, and every single contract carrying the syndicate's name belonged solely and completely to his granddaughter and absolute heir, Emily Scott Lee. The transfer had been sealed years ago. It could not be contested, reversed, or appealed. Gu Jun Kang had never owned this ground. He had merely been permitted to manage what had always belonged to her. The silence after those words had a texture to it. Kang's guards, the men who had stood at his shoulder for years, who had been present the night before when he discarded Emily in the rain, they turned. Not dramatically, not with a scene. They simply shifted their orientation, shoulders angling away from Kang, and bowed. Deep, formal, irreversible bows directed at the woman in the gold dress at the top of the marble steps. They had never been his men. They had been Lee Group men, placed in his household years ago. Patient as stones, Jia made a sound small and involuntary, the sound of a person whose floor has disappeared. The waitress, she whispered. The American girl. Her voice cracked apart on it. She took a step away from Kang. Then another. Instinct doing what pride would not allow reason to, Emily walked up the marble steps. She moved the way power moves when it is no longer performing itself, without announcement, without theater, just the pure forward motion of a woman who knows exactly where she is going and has earned every step of the ground beneath her feet. She stopped a few feet above Kang, and she looked down at him. He was still trying to find his face, trying to locate, inside himself, the man who had stood in this same courtyard less than 12 hours ago and called her nothing. That man was gone. What stood in his place was smaller and frightened and suddenly and completely alone. Emily looked at him for a long moment without speaking. She let the silence do its work. Then, quietly, and the quiet was everything, was the whole point, was the difference between rage and authority, she said. "You told me I was nothing. You told me your secretary understood the weight of your world." She looked out across the courtyard, across the estate, across everything he had spent years building his identity around. "Look at it, Kang. Look around you. Every building you walked through like an owner. Every account you spent from. The floor you are standing on right now." A pause. "All of it is mine." He looked. That was the part that stayed with Emily long after, not the kneeling, not the begging, not Jia's crumbling composure. It was the moment before all of that, the moment when Gu Jun Kang actually looked. When the words arrived not as information but as reality, not something being told to him but something he could physically feel happening in real time, the ground reorganizing beneath his feet, the architecture of his entire life revealing itself to have been built on property that never belonged to him. His guards would not meet his eyes. His drivers had stepped back from the vehicles. The men who had eaten at his table, who had stood at his shoulder through the negotiations and the late nights and the years of careful syndicate advancement, they were bowed toward Emily. Their shoulders turned away from him with a finality that was more devastating than any confrontation could have been, because it was not hostile. It was simply accurate. A correction of a long misalignment. They had always known whose name the ground answered to. They had simply been waiting, as Chairman Min had been waiting, as the documents had been waiting, for the morning the heir came to collect what was hers. Kang had no money, no men, no floor. He dropped. It was not a graceful descent, there was no dignity in it, no gesture of chosen humility. His legs simply decided they could no longer hold the weight of what he was understanding, and they gave. The hard marble met his knees, and he was down, and his hands were shaking, and his eyes, when he looked up at Emily, were wet with the specific and ugly emotion of a man who has only ever known how to be powerful, encountering, for the first time, the experience of having nothing. Emily. Her name in his mouth sounded different now.
Raw.
Like something scraped down to its nerve.
Please. I didn't know.
I swear to you I didn't know. I made a mistake. Everything, Jia, last night, the papers, it was a mistake. Let me make this right. Please. Jia fell beside him a breath later. The cream silk blouse, the perfect pinned hair, the entire careful architecture of a woman who had spent months positioning herself for exactly this life, and now she was on her knees on wet marble, hands reaching toward the hem of Emily's gold gown, not quite daring to touch it. Madam Li. Her voice had none of last night's silk in it. Madam Li, please, I was foolish. I didn't know who you were. I swear you. Emily stepped back. One clean step, removing her gown from the reach of their hands. She looked down at them, both this man and this woman, kneeling together on the marble of an estate that had been used the night before to humiliate her, begging now with the desperation of people who have just discovered that the thing they destroyed was the only thing standing between them and ruin. The smile that crossed Emily's face was slow and cold and completely without forgiveness.
Don't bow to me now, she said.
You already chose your side last night. You wanted to be a powerful couple. She tilted her head. Leave here together with exactly what you brought into my world. A pause. A single, precise breath. Nothing. She turned to Chairman Min. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform the moment. She simply gave the instructions: freeze every account Kang had touched by noon, repossess every vehicle, every card, every property registered in his name. She told Chairman Min that Gu Jun Kang would leave this estate wearing the clothes on his back and nothing else. Chairman Min nodded once. Closed the leather folio. The elite guard moved. Kang was lifted from the marble, not roughly, but with the absolute, final efficiency of men following an instruction they have no interest in debating. Jia scrambled to her feet beside him, clutching his arm, her earlier instinct to distance herself overridden now by the terror of being removed alone. They were walked down the driveway together, past the armored vehicles, past the men who would not look at them, through the iron gates and out onto the street. The gates closed. The sound they made was definitive. Not loud, just final, the way a lock sounds when it is turned by the right hand for the first time. Emily stood at the top of the marble steps and watched the gates close and felt the morning settle around her. The sun had fully risen now, gold and clean after the night's rain, and it fell across the courtyard in long, warm angles. The estate was quiet. The estate had always been quiet. She understood now that this was because it had always been waiting for its owner, and managed silence is a very different thing from inhabited peace. She was standing on her grandfather's ground. She was standing in her own story. Chairman Min appeared at her shoulder with the silent efficiency of a man who has served for decades and understands that presence is sometimes the only thing required.
He did not speak.
He simply stood, patient and steady, at the right distance, close enough to be available, far enough to give her the moment. Emily breathed in the cold morning air. The smell of rain still clung to the marble and the hedges and the iron of the gate. Somewhere in the city, traffic was beginning to build. Somewhere, a woman in a cream silk blouse was understanding that the life she had calculated herself into did not exist. Emily did not think about her. Not for long. She had earned the right to stop thinking about the people who had tried to diminish her. She thought about her grandfather instead. About the cedar and black tea smell of his study. About the way he had looked at her when she was 12, reading documents she wasn't supposed to understand, and the small, private pride in his expression when he realized she understood every word. About the way he had let her refuse the legacy, year after year, without ever removing it from her name because he understood, better than she had, that the right person for something doesn't stop being the right person simply because they aren't ready yet. She had been running from this for 4 years. She was done running. Several months had passed. Seoul moved the way it always moved, relentlessly, luminously, its towers lit against the night sky, and its streets carrying the compressed energy of a city that does not slow down for anyone's story, no matter how significant it feels from the inside. But inside the Kim estate, something had changed. Not the bones of the place, the marble, the iron gates, the long formal corridors, but the quality of the air inside it, the atmosphere, the particular way rooms feel when they are finally occupied by the right person. Emily ran the Lee Group now. She ran it the way she had always known privately that she would run it, not with the underground logic that had governed it for decades, not with the structure of leverage and shadow and men who owed favors to other men in rooms with no windows. She ran it with the long, careful patience of someone who understands that the most powerful thing a person can do with inherited machinery is decide what it should build, one industry at a time. She was pulling it toward the light. Logistics routes were being legitimized. Construction investments were moving toward transparent structures. Legal teams replaced the men who had previously handled problems through methods that left no paper trail. It was slow work, slower than she sometimes had the patience for. There was resistance. Men who had operated in the old way for 20 years didn't reorient because a woman in a gold dress asked them to. They reoriented because the woman in the gold dress held the documents that made her word law, and because Chairman Min stood behind every directive she issued with the quiet, immovable authority of a man who had helped build this machine from the ground up and understood exactly how much it could bear. She had days when the weight of it pressed down on her like a physical thing. Days when she sat at her grandfather's desk in the East Wing and felt the enormity of what she had inherited and wondered if she was doing it justice, if she was moving fast enough, if she was making the right decisions. On those days, she thought about Mapo, about the narrow balcony and the pojangmika smell and the chipped blue coffee mug, and the 4 years she had spent building an ordinary life out of determination and grief and the stubborn human need to exist on one's own terms. She thought about those years without regret. She had needed them. The woman who had come home to this estate in a gold dress on a clear morning had been built in that small apartment, by that ordinary life, not despite it. Gu Jun Kang had disappeared into the city the way things disappear when they lose all supporting structure. Not dramatically, not with an explosion, just a gradual erasure. His name no longer opened doors. His calls went unreturned. He was somewhere in Seoul's backstreets, which is a large and indifferent place to be when you have nothing. Jia had left him inside 3 weeks. Emily had heard this through Chairman Min, who mentioned it with the flat brevity he applied to all information he considered self-evident. Emily had said nothing in response. She had turned back to the document on her desk and continued reading. There was nothing in Jia's departure that required a reaction, because there had been nothing in Jia that required one. The woman had built her entire plan around a man's borrowed power, and when that power dissolved, she had done the only calculation left available to her and walked away from the debt. It was the most predictable thing about the whole story. The night that stays with Emily, the night she returns to, when she needs to remember what the whole arc of it cost, and what it gave is not the morning in the courtyard. It is not the moment Kang dropped his knees, or the moment Chairman Min read the decree, or the moment the gates closed behind the two of them and the estate went quiet. It is a night several weeks later. She had been working late in the East Wing, the city quiet outside the tall windows, when she had put down her pen and walked through the estate to the balcony overlooking the western garden. Seoul was spread out beyond the estate walls in every direction, its lights layered and deep and restless, the Han River a dark ribbon threading through the middle of it, the towers lit up against the black sky, like an ongoing argument about height. She had stood at the railing and held her glass and felt the night air against her face and her arms and the exposed stretch of her collarbones, and she had felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not victory exactly. Not satisfaction, though that was part of it. Peace. The specific, earned, quiet kind of peace that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from the knowledge that you are standing on the right side of your own story. That the choices you made, all of them, including the ones that cost you, including the years of ordinary life, including the marriage that broke you open, have brought you to exactly the place you were always meant to be. That nothing was wasted. That the long game, played with patience and integrity, and the refusal to become smaller than you are just because someone needed you smaller, has always been worth the length of it. Her grandfather had known. He had known when she refused the inheritance, and he had kept it in her name anyway. He had known when she flew to Seoul and stripped her name to 2 syllables, and he had let her go, because he understood that the heir he had built this for could not become what she needed to be by being handed it before she was ready. She had needed to be broken down to her bones and then choose from that place to stand back up. She had stood. She raised her glass to the city, to Seoul, which had swallowed her whole and given her back to herself. To her grandfather, who had loved her wisely enough to wait. To the woman in the small Mapo apartment who had held her own hands in the dark on the worst night and made a phone call that changed everything. And to everyone who has ever been standing in a room holding the key to something enormous, waiting for the moment they finally decide they are ready to use it, she raised her glass to them too, because the story of a woman who knows who she is cannot be ended by a man who doesn't. Play the long game. Trust the quiet. Choose the light. Your victory has always been written. The only question is when you decide to claim it.